Commission for International Women's Day. I'd just like to start off today's human rights talk with an introduction by Susan Ryan, the Age and Disability Discrimination Commissioner.
Thank you, and good afternoon on International Women's Day. Of course, I start by acknowledging that we're meeting on the traditional land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and express my respect to their elders past and present. Well, International Women's Day 2016, congratulations to all of us. I always like to mark International Women's Day by a bit of a celebratory rave about all the changes women have achieved. We know, courtesy of our distinguished RightsTalk speaker today, Jane Aeberhard-Hodges, that we're going to hear about a lot of very serious matters that remain to be addressed, and indeed we're going to hear about how they're going to be addressed. But I think it is very important to celebrate how far we've come. I look for different datelines, but on International Women's Day, I always like to wear this badge, which was the badge for the first International Women's Year conference ever held. It was held in Mexico City in 1975, and the badge was the dove of peace, the women's sign, and equality. And they're sort of collector's items now, and I managed to dig mine out of the bottom of my box of badges once a year. But really looking at the sustainability objectives now, they are not very different from the objectives we set in 1975. But 1975 did kick off a lot of global attention to things that were holding women back from equality. And ever since then, of course, there's been a much more heightened awareness and much more activity within the UN, the ILO, and so on, focusing on these things. The other thing I'd say about achieving reforms for women towards equality does take a very long time. And often we think we've achieved something, and lo and behold, it's unachieved in front of our very eyes. When I managed to get the passage of the Sex Discrimination Act through our Parliament in 1984, I thought, this is terrific because it makes illegal any sort of discrimination against women in the workforce, including on the grounds of maternity. It makes sexual harassment in the workforce unlawful, and so on. So I thought, this is good. Now we can go forward. Well, of course, here we are in 2016, and we still have huge issues of sexual harassment in the workforce, and we still have, and we're reminded of this by the work of the former Commissioner Elizabeth Broderick, evidence that women do experience discrimination in their jobs when they become pregnant, when they're on maternity leave, and when they return from maternity leave. So I don't sink into the slough of despond about the fact that we've gone backwards, because in many ways we have gone forwards. Yesterday, for International Women's Day, I spoke to a group of Year 11 girls, and I could kind of see their eyes glaze over as I tried to get them to focus on what a different world it is now for young women going into their working lives than it was for us in the 70s. What an array of jobs they can choose from, what an array of support services. We know that childcare needs more funding, but we didn't have it at all. We know that the maternity leave provisions could be more generous. We didn't have any. We know that there is still job discrimination against women causing the dreadful gender pay gap, but at the same time, we do have women in senior positions, in business, in Parliament, on the bench, in universities, and so forth. So I think it is worthwhile acknowledging that we have since, say, that International Women's Year in 1975, we have changed the landscape for women. But that is not to say, of course, that there aren't many other big changes needed. And so I would invite you, first of all, to think about the positive changes we have achieved for women, and then also pay attention to what we're going to have to do to carry that whole reform process forward, so that the goals that we had of peace, equality and development back in 1975 and the sustainability millennium goals now become closer and closer. So it's my great pleasure, and we're very honoured, Jane, to have today you as our guest speaker. Jane Aeberhard-Hodges has an extraordinary international experience in women's policy, particularly in women's workplace experiences. She's the International Human Rights Consultant and a UN Senior Research Associate, and she was previously the Director for the Bureau for Gender Equality at the ILO. Now, Jane is going to speak to us today on the issue of gender-based violence and sexual harassment at work in the context of international developments on women and work. And she brings the wealth of all those many years' experience, Jane, that you had at the ILO, which is kind of the world centre of workplace policy analysis and reform. And I think we're very fortunate to have you here to be our RightsTalk speaker on International Women's Day 2016. So please welcome Jane.
Thank you. So we need to give each other a rounding happy International Women's Day wish. Happy International Women's Day. And I want to thank the Australian Human Rights Commission for giving us this time, both to celebrate, but also to take care and take heed of what's happening worldwide. The moment is now, and last November at the International Labour Organization headquarters in Geneva, an important decision was taken. After 3 years of quite serious lobbying, the body that decides the agendas of the great ILO future work, which is usually done through its conferences, the body deciding this said, all right, we've had papers, we've had debates, we are now going to put on the agenda a future binding treaty to end gender-based violence at work. And that agenda slot will be for 2018. But the work is starting now. This very year, in 2016, the ILO will hold a tripartite expert meeting on the subject because it is tricky. For some, it might be a no-brainer. Stop gender-based violence, it's pretty obvious, surely. And yet there was a huge amount of trouble to get this item onto the agenda of the International Labour Organization. The workers' group, the ILO, I should explain to you, is made up of, has a tripartite character. 3 groups speak with equal voice in almost all ILO meetings: representatives of workers, representatives of employers, and representatives from ministries of labour and employment. It's the only specialised agency of the whole UN system where business and labour have a voice and can vote and speak, and therefore the work that comes out of the ILO is incredibly reliable and robust because it's had that real input, serious debating on an equal footing. So the workers' group have right from the start been very keen to have a binding treaty on this matter. Some of the government group were very keen. Interestingly, the United States of America spoke very strongly in all the debates about a future possible convention, apparently on direct instructions from President Obama. The European Union members were slightly divided, but basically came out strongly. Italy, for example, was a leader. Australia came into bat for a binding treaty about halfway through the debates. Who am I leaving out? The workers, mixed bag with the groups, the government groups. Some of the Asian states, I should say, were not at all keen, but that is no surprise. They don't want any new binding treaties on anything, on conditions of work in mines, or social security, or gender-based violence. So it was more of a strategic decision on their part to say no. So who am I missing? Who's the third pillar that I was talking about? The employers. The employers were not keen on this item at the beginning. And why would the employers be saying no? We don't want a binding treaty or even a non-binding instrument. In the ILO, we have conventions and recommendations, and the recommendations are, as their name suggests, merely recommending action. They're not binding like a convention is. Why did the employers not even want that? Because of the ongoing financial crisis. The employers group was saying, we know gender-based violence is costing us. We know that productivity is down when domestic violence spills over into the workplace. We know all these things, but that is not the main problem. The main thing we want out of the ILO is jobs, jobs, jobs. And when we're over the job crisis, then we'll look at these interesting things like gender-based violence. The interesting point to this introduction is that the employers have changed. In the 3 years of the toing and froing and debating, should we have this on the conference in the future, for a future binding treaty, should we not? They finally came around and said, okay, we're seeing so much indecent work because of violence against women and girls. We need a standard. But let's not jump in. Let's have this expert group meeting in 2016, which will probably be held in October in Geneva, and they'll get 8 representative experts from the workers' group, 8 from the representing employers, and 8 from different governments to thrash out some of the original problems and get as far ahead as they can so that when the preparations are made for the big debate in 2018, some of the issues will have been done, will have been sorted. Of course, the conference in 2018 can decide to do what it likes. It's sovereign in that sense, but they'll have this incredibly important homework already done. Now, before we go any further, let's just get some of the myths out of the way. It's very clear, and these are the sort of myths that, in fact, pervade the media that I'm seeing very often in this very country, about sexual harassment and, by extension, the more broader gender-based violence. The myth is that it's a one-off thing. There's a couple of rotten apples. It usually is men harassing women, but it can be the other way around. It's quite rare. That is a complete myth. That is wrong. We've had a huge number of studies come out, starting with the World Health Organization and then going through regional bodies like the European Institute for Gender Equality, that are showing that up to half of all working women at some stage in their working life, I'm not saying every woman every day, but the research is showing a huge percentage perceive that they have been harassed sexually. The other myth is that this is just a harmless, flirtatious, what was the word they were using on the television with the cricketer, a joke? Well, in fact, no. The other series of studies, again, coming particularly from World Health, where from the point of view of occupational safety and health, are showing enormous costs to health systems, to social security, social service systems, and of course to individual businesses and women and men who are the victims of harassment. There's a large number, I'm sure we could all pick up a word each, going beyond absenteeism, inordinate use of sick leave, fear to come to the workplace, actual damage to plant and equipment because of the harassment, the victim being not careful because they're fearful of harassing behaviour. It is, in fact, and must be recognised as offensive and insulting, and throughout the world, illegal. Another myth is that this is, in fact, just part of life. This is something to do with the XY chromosome, the XX chromosomes, that this is just part of normality. Well, in fact, it's not. It is not normal. And any person who has been harassed and has felt that burning physical reaction to the harassment will know that is not normal behaviour. Another myth, that it will go away. Just pay no heed, turn your back, button up your shirt, go away, and this will just dissolve in itself. Might have been a one-off, it might be linked to that idea that this is rare. That also is wrong. If no reaction is given, the behaviour will continue. It will continue. And many of the court cases that I'll come to towards the end of this presentation will show you where the judges have come down very strongly on this idea that the employer, who's by law must provide a safe and healthy workplace, has said, well, don't worry, dear, just turn your back, go away, don't go down to the cafe, don't go in the elevator with that bloke, it'll go away. And the employers have been severely criticised by the courts and, of course, penalised with large awards made against them. The main thrust of what I'll be saying, of course, is about the spillover of domestic or family violence into the workplace. And you'll often hear it said that this is not a workplace issue. Domestic violence is a home issue. It's between two people in the privacy of their home. Wrong, wrong. The home is no longer a completely unregulated place. The ILO's work, for example, on domestic workers and protecting them came up against this same argument, saying, well, no, you can't regulate domestic workers because they're actually in the privacy of a home. The mistress or the master of the house can do what they like because this is not a classical workplace. Wrong. We now have a highly ratified convention saying that that domestic work is work, and therefore these persons are entitled to leaves, correct pay, decent working conditions. The same goes for violence. The spillover into the workplace is being tracked in a large number of countries, and I'm pleased to say that Australia is a leading country on this work, and there are over 900 enterprise agreements that now have domestic violence clauses in them. It's a mixed bag. Some concern leave, some concern other domestic violence related matters, but Australia has been leading and we are being followed by countries as varied as the Philippines. They want to know about the methodology, they want to know about the conclusions, they want to know about the impact of having negotiated clauses. Countries like Turkey are interested. Canada came on very, very early and have already done their own questionnaires in workplaces using the Australian methodology. The UK, Italy, and I could go on. But another myth is that it's just a matter, complaints about harassment are brought because of other workplace gripes, that this is just revenge in another name. No, the complaints are, in fact, they should be taken seriously. Are in most large international companies well structured in the company's codes, or in fact in the ethics areas that companies have to follow. And of course, this myth that being strong against gender-based violence will in fact lead to an uglier world. There won't be the occasional compliment. There won't be the little pattings and minor tendernesses that make work fun. Well, it's another myth. Whoever thinks that minor touchings and so forth are fun needs to wake up and come into the 21st century. The data are very important. But before, yes, well, I'll leap into the data. I've mentioned several times the WHO annual surveys. Very, very methodologically strong, but they look at gender-based violence generally, not just in the workplace. It is one of the criteria it uses. The IGE survey, of course, and there are 4 very important national surveys that have come out in recent times, which probably did influence, that's my mere supposition, but they probably did influence the employers about face regarding an ILO treaty, because these 4 studies commenced with one in the United Kingdom, then by the Department of Labour of the United States of America, only on workplace costs. Then New Zealand, a very, very important study about 2 years ago showing a massive cost to New Zealand employers by allowing gender-based violence and not addressing the spillover, for example, of domestic violence. and lastly, of course, Australia. And here we have to thank again the Commission for its work and particularly the important data that came out in 2012 about the prevalence of sexual harassment. So again, this myth that this is a rare occurrence, that there's one or two bad apples. No, this is much more common and a serious workplace issue. And we've also seen some of the data about complaints coming out from the Australian Sex Commissioner about complaints for sexual harassment and gender-based violence zooming up. They're not many, but they've, if I'm not wrong, quadrupled in the last few years, coming to this very commission. So let me take a moment and talk to you about why is this decision to have the expert meeting in 2016 so important as homework for a possible treaty in 2018. There's been work actually on sexual harassment in the workplace, in the ILO sphere, for decades. Some very important work was done in the 80s, particularly from the point of view of occupational safety and health. And this was seen as a workplace risk. So all the risk management gurus were looking at sexual harassment as a threat to productivity. But also, and importantly, it was seen as a human rights issue in the ILO, right from the adoption of the main discrimination convention, number 111. That convention was adopted in 1958, and in the decades following, a system of supervision, like all treaty bodies, there's a specialised system that checks whether ratifying governments in fact do what they said they'll do when they signed on. And sexual harassment has always been raised in the context of Convention 111. This most recent report of the supervisory body this very year lists 10 countries that have problems by name. You can ask me who they are later. It's an interesting group. So Convention 111 has been the source of a lot of ILO jurisprudence and policy advice for decades. But there are an additional 2 other conventions of the ILO, these binding treaties once ratified, that specifically use the words harassment, sexual harassment, or abuse, or all 3 words. And they are the Indigenous Peoples Convention, number 169, that very clearly states that Indigenous women and men should not be subject to sexual harassment, because this at the time was seen as a particular issue in for that particularly vulnerable population and peoples across the world. And the most recent text that I mentioned earlier, the Domestic Workers Convention, number 189, also has a very strong Article 5 saying that domestic workers, because of their particular vulnerability, working in private homes, out of the spotlight, they should not be subject to violence or abuse of any kind, sexual, physical, psychological, financial, and so forth. So there's 3 conventions that are giving us a good basis, 111, 169, and 189. But you can see they're rather zoomed in, targeted in on particular groups. There are also 3 recommendations of the ILO that cover sexual harassment specifically. And it's an interesting group as well, quite modern texts. Recommendation 200 on HIV and AIDS in the workplace makes a specific number of clauses about the vulnerability to HIV of having a gender-based, gender violenced workplace, but also the other side of the coin, the problem in the workplace of being vulnerable to getting it, but once you have it, you've been identified as carrying the virus, the incredible workplace discrimination that could occur. The second recommendation concerns forced labour, very modern text with a protocol, but this particular recommendation singles out violence that women and men who are in slave-like conditions, forced labour conditions, are vulnerable to. And it has some strong wording saying policy should outlaw this and practice must follow up to implement the policy. And the third one is a very recent recommendation on transformation from the informal sector to the formal sector. It's obviously linked to the jobs, jobs, jobs message. But interestingly, in the debate leading to the adoption of that text, the employers came out and said, yes, we agree. One of the issues, the barriers to workers reaching out and becoming part of the formal economy was this issue of violence in the workplace, particularly gender-based violence. So 3 binding conventions, 3 recommendations give us a good standard to start with. But the member states of the ILO were realising it was just a little too scattered. And those that spoke in favour of having an eventual gender-based violence at work convention were saying one of the ideas will be not to redo this good work of the last decades, but to draw it together into one solidified text, a codified text. Obviously, the ILO works closely with other UN agencies, in particular the treaty bodies that enforce the international covenants. A lot of work has come out of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights to stop gender-based violence, and they've introduced a very interesting concept of financial violence. By underpaying workers, you're actually leaving them in a vulnerable situation, leading to possibly them being victims of violence. And clearly the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, has both influenced ILO decisions, and we likewise have strengthened the committee that enforces CEDAW in its approach to workplace violence. The regional instruments are becoming more and more numerous, specifically on gender-based violence. And although they might have a broader context, they are including strong sections on violence at work. The most common one that you hear of perhaps is the Istanbul Treaty adopted by the Council of Europe a couple of years ago, highly ratified, highly adopted. Likewise, some European Union directives, and regional groups like the CARICOM for the Caribbean countries have come out with some model texts. For example, a model text on how to go about adopting and what the substance should be of a sexual harassment law to stop sexual harassment at work. So well done, CARICOM, for bringing out a model text that's very, very specific. And of course, the Americas have been very strong, led by Brazil, where a number of extremely violent cases involving women workers led the Organization of American States to adopt protocols on the subject. Another new reason why the time is ripe for an international text coming from the ILO is, as I mentioned, this large amount of data coming out. The 4 national studies, as I told you. The Australian study, if I recall, actually said that by 2021, the cost to the Australian economy of letting violence go unheeded at work would rise to $15.6 billion. $15.6 billion. That was a bit of a shock, I think, to everyone, and hence Australian universities, research centres, and of course various government institutions starting to work on this domestic violence, workplace violence link had its origin in some of these data. Another reason why it's important to look at the context for a possible treaty is cyber harassment. A Dutch study has just come out of 19 European countries, which made me think again of those myths that I just showed you. Cyber violence, well, yes, it's a one-off. Oh, there might be one bad apple. Then most people don't know how to use their computers anyway. How would they be sending around harassing data or information? Wrong, it's a myth. Cyber violence is incredibly dangerous, insidious, and it's growing. The online violence is often perceived as not real because you actually can't see it. You can't, the bruises from the bashed worker aren't visible. But mental cruelty, the psychological impact, is now being tracked with empirical data to show it is just as dangerous as the cracked ribs and the constant headaches. Interestingly, not only in the Dutch study, but in other EU work, the need came out very much for both the police and the courts, the judiciary, to understand cyber harassment and cyber violence. Perhaps a lack of technological savviness was there, perhaps not, but it was never taken seriously. And some of the questionnaire work at the basis of these studies I'm referring to, at least in Europe, was showing that people were underestimating the amount of cyber violence, but also had no clue how to counter it. And would basically call in the IT people and say, well, the IT people will fix it, won't they? Oh yes, we've got a filter. We've got a filter so that we don't get outside trashy constant emails. But email storms can be incredibly simply done. And the effect not only on the individual worker, particularly let's take workers in call centres whose work is to be online during their working time, the long-term effect of having that kind of harassment is now being counted. And when it's counted, it's horrifically present. The studies are also showing that there's a complete lack of training anyway as to how to handle cyber harassment. Very few multinationals have done it seriously, although they're the ones that seem to come out in answering the questionnaires and saying, oh, no, we have a no harassment policy, but cyber harassment, we hadn't really thought of that. So I think there's work to be done there, and those of you who are present from research institutes might be thinking about some good research questions, some good doctorate questions around that area of gender-based violence through the cyberspace. Another reason why a text would be really, really needed now is the importance of the national developments. Over 70 countries have new or revamped gender-based violence laws. They can be in the form of labour codes. Penal codes is very, very common. And that's the message that's come out from the UN human rights bodies, particularly the treaty bodies, that gender-based violence must be a criminal offence. But also a lot has been happening in the area of occupational safety and health legislation, torts law developments, and I've even got some interesting cases from Australia where trespass has been used, the common law ground of trespass, to find an employer guilty. You can't talk about national developments without mentioning these big court decisions and the media attention that has been given to these decisions. And here I now am going to run you right to some of them. And living where I was for so long in Geneva, you would be surprised at how much airspace was in fact given to the David Jones case. Some of you must be familiar with that important case here in Australia. And when I sort of saw the black and white logo flashed across, I think it was France 24 TV station, I'm going, what, David Jones? Have they done something good? No, they did something very bad. And the world got to hear about it. So that was a 2010 case. But here are some other ones that I found were very interesting. Everyone would probably, who studied the area of sexual harassment, will remember the Vishaka case out of India. Very, very well quoted throughout the world, because it was the first time the highest court of the land stood up and gave, in its judgment, not as obiter dicta, not as a side offence, but an actual statement of the zero policy towards sexual harassment at work. And it ordered a lot of new preventive measures, including, for the first time, a Supreme Court ordering employers to undertake training. It ordered them to set up complaints committees to have actual structures so it wouldn't be a one-off event. Workers had to know that in addition to complaints, for example, for non-payment of wages or non-payment of overtime or dangerous machinery, that you could treat sexual harassment exactly in the workplace as a workplace issue. Chronologically, a decade or so after that, doing some work in the ILO's training centre in the town of Turin, where we do train judges, we came across a number of very odd decisions that were coming out where defences of employers saying, oh, there was that one bad apple, I've got rid of him, because it normally was a man harassing a female co-worker, but it's nothing to do with me. I'm not liable for the actions of that person. I'm not vicariously liable. And in fact, I really hated that action, and I was hurt to the bone to think that my female workers were suffering this kind of outrageous behaviour. So in this case, the employer actually won using that argument, saying, I really tried to convince the workforce that this was a bad thing. The male worker was in fact guilty of outrageous behaviour. We can go there, but it's really ugly. He was only fined 10,000 Australian dollars, but he was fined something, and basically did stay on, although the employer was threatening to get rid of him. But by saying that he'd actually asked workers to sign up to some kind of explicit code of conduct on which many things were enumerated, including zero tolerance for sexual harassment, without defining it, without being specific. That was the employer's defence. And also the fact that it had a few seminars, half-hour coffee and cake with someone coming in, my sister coming in to talk about it, not knowing whether it was from a professional person who understood the issue or someone from social services or whatever. But he got away with it. That was a case to worry us. So we started to look again. Around the same time, in other jurisdictions, this time being the United States, some really good decisions were coming out saying no to sexual harassment at work. And the Novartis case was interesting from many points of view. Huge fine against the company, this huge multinational, which in fact is based down the road from us in Switzerland, from the ILO. The facts there were horrific as well, in that these were not, as one might expect in a pharmaceutical company, women working on in big pharmaceutical chemical plants. These were actually extremely well-trained, highly educated, diplomaed women chemists who happened to have a job in Novartis to go out and sell major medical equipment, such as imagery equipment, to the big hospitals in the United States. You know, go to Mount Sinai, you need all new mammography material, and these highly trained professionals were not just glorified salesperson. They really know the stuff, and they were all medically trained as well. But part of the training, when they were, shall we say, being polished up to go out and speak to the big clients, part of the training was actually involving them in sexual harassment, and basically saying, if you're having a bit of a hard sell with this medical director, if you're really having a problem, maybe you could perhaps offer yourself, and not only do you get the X-ray machine, but you can have me. Can you believe that training in this decade, it was a very, very long case. The facts go way back into the late 1990s. It took them 10 years to finally get to the New York Supreme Court. But this kind of behaviour was considered appropriate, training people to go out and sell medical machinery. There were other instances there, of course. There was a large problem of unequal pay between the women and men doing very similar work. And there was also a large number of pregnancy-based dismissals. So the final award covered many issues. But all these highly trained, qualified medical persons, women, decided to group together and bring a class action, and they won. At the same time, a few years on, we have the Australian case against Oracle. I wonder how many of you remember this one, where the harassment again was so obvious and so clearly stated. There was no confusion about the facts, that this awful man was continually, verbally, and with sexual innuendo, and including some of the physical pressuring of his co-worker, both very high managers in the company Oracle. And so she won, but she got a lousy settlement, 18,000 Australian dollars for this, for months and months of humiliation and degradation at the hands of this serial harasser. And she was given, for example, no out-of-pocket medical expenses, although she'd been to several psychiatrists as a result of the harassment, who gave expert evidence in the proceedings, talking about the large amount of suffering she had gone through, including awful problems of down to the fact that she was sleeping badly and grinding her teeth, and she was going to have major dental work as well. And that wasn't going to be ordered in the first instance. Luckily, well, both sides appealed, but luckily on the full panel of the federal court actually said, and that's why I put the words in blue, when revising that first decision, yes, she won, but it was such a high price for her to pay for her victory, everything she'd lost, and she had to leave the firm. She couldn't take it anymore. So they overturned the earlier judgment and ordered that she receive $130,000. Now, it's nothing like the millions that the Novartis women received, but some justice was done and her legal fees were paid. Here's a very recent case that came out of the Fair Work Commission, and this is a good one that brings home the link between domestic violence and the workplace. This was an issue between a male and a female worker in the same company, and she had in fact been to court and got a restraining order concerning her male partner. And the court asked the employer to make sure that this was in fact seriously abided by, that the gentleman, I hesitate to use that word, be kept at least 3 meters away from her in all situations when they're in the same room or in the same building. So what did the employer do? He actually called her in, so the problem was her, and said, how can we go about this? What are we going to do? We have to have team meetings. We can't always have you at one end of the table and him at the other. And she said to the employer, have you called him in and asked what his opinion might be? Have you actually talked to your HR persons about this? This is a court order that you have to abide by. And basically the employer started to exclude her, to leave her out of meetings and so forth, and basically, again, constructive dismissal. She just gave up and left because she was seen as the problem rather than the harassment and the harasser. She had the courage to bring a case and won. It was the maximum amount allowed under the Fair Work Act, which is actually, again, I think, not a lot for all the suffering she went through. But the interesting thing is she was a valued employee and her work had been very valuable, and she found a job basically the next day. But to have to go through the resignation period and the worry about finding a new job, yes, she did finally get one. But it's been hailed as a landmark ruling because it was made very clear that the employer really has to abide by this and be careful of how they handle domestic violence orders. You can't say this is a family matter, this is not a workplace matter. That is just wrong these days. Well, I don't want to go too far down into what a convention might have, but these are the kind of national developments. I'm giving you examples from Australia because I'm hoping they're resonating with you, but jurisdictions like the Nigerian Industrial Court, where we train some judges, have actually come out with a very, very recent decision against Microsoft Nigeria, not unlike our Oracle case. The facts were clearly outrageous, straight, old-fashioned touching up by a male high-up worker against a female co-worker, thought they'd get away with it, told the employer it's just normal, it's what we in a male culture of Nigeria are expected to do with co-workers. And the court came down heavily and said, you're wrong and you're going to have to pay. And the employer is vicariously liable, and you're going to have to pay for that outrageous workplace violation. The Kenyan Industrial Court, in the 2010 case involving hospital, where, and this is an interesting one because I've been talking very much about co-worker or supervisor harassment, but this is in a hospital in Kenya, a very famous hospital in Nairobi, where it was clients basically attacking the nurses sexually and holding them up with, again, some pretty bordering on rape type actions. And the woman nurses got together and brought a case, and the hospital said, well, it's nothing to do with us. It's the clients that are doing this. We've got a no harassment code and we talk to our workers regularly. Rubbish. The Industrial Court of Kenya came down with a very, very large fine in Kenyan shillings against the hospital. There's also a series of cases out of the United States. Many of you might remember the series of cases against universities. The Harvard Law School case I love to quote because I speak a lot with universities and law schools, and they tend to think they've got a perfect work environment. But the Harvard Law School was found guilty of not having a policy, and not, when it did have some small sentence in some general ethical code about gender-based violence, it wasn't even implementing that. The last and important point, I've talked about the linking to international treaties, I've talked about the advent of cyber harassment, I've talked about these national developments, particularly some big cases and media attention to the cases. But this last area that is really important, and that the ILO, I hope, will take up when it comes to debating the actual substance of a treaty, is this clear link between the spillover of domestic violence to the workplace. And here I'm going to ask you to bear with me, and this is a real story. Doing some training with a very, very large Sao Paulo firm with over 2,000 employees, I entered the workplace, dropped off by the UN car, and I thought it was a bit odd. There were a couple of young guys wandering around the car park as I walked up towards the main gate where the CEO was waiting to greet me. And I thought they looked a bit funny, but got on with my job. Just as we're starting this one-day intensive training for the CEOs, in fact, it was about, not just about sexual harassment, I was actually doing training about women on boards. Bells go off, alarms start to ring. I think it's a fire practice, but no. The cell phones are put on speaker, and there's a cry from the reception area, from the receptionist, to come down immediately. It's all in Portuguese, but I got the gist of it. And we are ordered down into the reception area, where one of those shady-looking persons has introduced a giant gun and is waving the gun around the head of the receptionist and basically saying the equivalent of, Maria has jilted me, I'm going to kill you all. Spillover of domestic violence into the workplace, it gets worse. People could not, he got the PA system through the receptionist and started to shout abuse to the whole factory, because here we were in the management section, the whole factory was out spreading over a large area of this part of town, and he starts to yell into the PA abusive language, Maria has broken my heart and other parts of me, and I'm now going to kill you all. Thrusts the receptionist away and grabs the two of the CEOs. So I'm hoping that the UN security is going to get whiff of this and come and save us all. There was a happy ending, yes, the police did manage to break in. But I spent a pretty sweaty, worried few hours because there was no understanding of that this would happen, that there was no control of the entrance in, there was no guns being checked for at the reception area. And this receptionist was in fact alone, whereas in some parts of the world you'll always have guards basically just to control street people or something coming in. But this was a terrifying incident. As I said, the happy ending is no one was hurt. Maria did not lose her job as the gun-waving jilted lover wanted, and the company now does have serious sexual harassment code and a serious policy and a lot of training. The Australian approach, as I said, was linked to that data that came out in 2012, not only from this commission, but from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And bless them, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the ACTU, took this up, and a lot, as I mentioned, of enterprise agreements now contain domestic violence clauses. The classic clause is a leave-related clause, so that the person experiencing the violence doesn't use up their sick leave, but they might need to go to court to get a restraining order. They might need to be home. They might need to go again and again to give evidence at a police station or at court. They might need to be going to schools because the jilted lover is threatening to take their child out of school and kidnap the child. Rather than use sick leave or exceptional leave, which a lot of employers do allow for exceptional circumstances, the domestic violence clauses are specifically related to domestic violence. Some could be 3 days, some can be as many as 20. The ACTU is pushing to have in a modern award, which will have hearings this very October here in Australia, to have 10 days paid domestic violence leave to become the norm. That would be 10 days paid for permanent workers and 10 days unpaid for casual workers. And that claim, as I say, will go before the Fair Work Commission. Interestingly, the employers in Australia did their own survey of the few years that domestic clauses had been floating around, and extremely interesting impact results. First of all, to debunk a myth right off, oh, another type of leave, all these workers are going to be suddenly claiming domestic violence leave and disappearing, and no one's going to be on the shop floor, no widgets will be made, no claims are going to be processed. No, their own research shows that to date, the employees that do ask for leave are few. They are usually women, and they usually request only between 2 to 3 days. So this idea that it's going to be an abused provision is wrong. 49.3% of the respondents reported that having an agreement with domestic violence clauses has demonstrated their support for staff, that they value staff, and it has resulted in their opinion, a more positive, supportive work environment. So a positive spin-off. That's 49.3%, almost half. 18.7%, about a fifth, stated that having domestic violence clauses have enhanced the overall employer reputation and status, not only within their industry, but throughout Australia. So they're seeing another benefit of having it, of having negotiated such clauses. So we must watch this space, and I'd love to hear some questions or some comments from those of you who are perhaps more familiar with the ACTU Modern Award claim to see where we're going to go on that. The same study, it was a bit difficult to judge, but because of the data was a bit patchy in places. But one of the findings was, by having such clauses, employers were saving. Yes, that's right. They were saving on money spent on internal complaints. So a lot can be said about the timing for an ILO convention. What might it involve? I don't want to get too technical, particularly for those of you that might not be familiar with what international treaties look like, but it has to have a good definition. It has to make it clear, what are we talking about here in gender-based violence, violence against women, and sexual harassment. It has to be very clear as to what its goal is, that this is a worldwide issue and it is not going away, it is getting worse, and a treaty will have to say that this behaviour is wrong. It will have to have some influence, some specificity about the particular vulnerable groups. We mentioned earlier on the Indigenous groups that since the 1980s have been protected by the ILO Convention 169, but there's a lot of at-risk industries. The healthcare cases that I gave you some examples from is clearly one where gender-based violence is on the increase, but also hospitality industry is marked for the vulnerability of the workers in that industry. You might remember the famous New York Sofitel case, where the leader of another multilateral organisation accosted a maid. We'll have to be very clear about the multiple roles. This is not just for ministries of labour or for the judiciary or for social services or for the police or, for that matter, education or the health ministry. This is an absolute subject matter that really requires an all-of-government approach. It has to be very clear as well, of course, that this is the vicarious liability of employers is now part of international labour law. It'll have to talk about training. It'll have to talk about how to do complaints. Interestingly, it will have to be very careful about the burden of proof, because in most of the jurisdictions that I've cited, the law is very clear in sex discrimination cases in general, but also sexual harassment cases, that once the alleged victim makes out a prima facie case, it is for the employer to prove that this in fact was not discrimination. That's what we mean about the burden of proof, and that is very well founded in international law on discrimination. So I leave for the very last bullet point there, this link to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs as they're commonly called. Goal 5 is on gender equality, and one of the indicators under Goal 5 is exactly this, ending gender-based violence. So let's hope that the ILO Convention gets to that, uses that incredible leverage of the worldwide adoption of these SDGs, and that one day I'll be coming back to talk to you with handing out copies of a new ILO Convention on the subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. I hope that was as insightful and interesting for all of you. That was an extremely comprehensive overview of exactly what's happening around the world internationally in this area of gender-based violence in the workplace. So we have a little bit of time for questions if people would like to pose a couple of questions, and then we'll wrap up. Yeah, there's a question over there. We've got 2 mics roving. So just put your hands up and then a mic will come right towards you.
Hi. Oh, that's very loud. Would you have any recommendations about how to take this high level and filter it down? I'm specifically thinking in terms of victim blaming behaviors in our culture, and what you said about cyberbullying. 9 months ago, I was sitting in a police officer's office with a DV victim, and actually had the police officer say, cyber stalking's not really stalking, there's nothing here that we can prove in a court of law, the prosecutor's not going to be bothered with this, why don't you just move house?
Do you want to take a few questions, or I'll go straight in now?
Do you want to take a few
No, I'll go straight in on that one. Well, I'm glad to hear that there's another real life case. I'm just sad that we have so many real life cases. It's exactly what the Dutch study was showing, that the police and the judiciary just don't think it's violence. It's somewhere out there in the web, on the web, in the cyberspace, and they're wrong. If we were to get an international convention, which would become binding for all the states that ratify it, filtering it down to the workplace is, of course, the real test. Having the convention is one thing, having people, states, sign up to it is another thing, but really having it done in the workplace is so important. Part of the way the ILO does this is by having regular reporting. When a state signs on, every 4 or so years, a report has to be sent in. But what is special about the ILO system of supervising this implementation is that workers and employers organisations are allowed to make their own comments, not only on that government report, but also from their own knowledge of the situation. And this has been in the ILO constitution for some decades, and it's really well used. So you'll get groups like the ACTU, and I would not wish to put words in their mouth, but they have that right and they use it to say, well, thank you, government, for sending the ILO report on gender-based violence and how everything's hunky-dory, but it's a bunch of lies. And I've seen reports where the workers' groups will say, no, the government report is a sham. Here's what the real data is. And that report and the comments of the workers and employers go into the system and have equal value. And therefore, the bodies that supervise can drill down and say, well, thank you, government, but it appears we've got comments that say this is, in fact, not the case. Let's enter into a dialogue on this. But this question of yours is interesting from another point of view. Some of you might realise that in the context of the Human Rights Council, just down the hill from the ILO, they meet in Geneva, there's been a very strong movement to have adopted in the UN, in the United Nations system, a treaty linking human rights and businesses. Moving on from some work that took 10 years to arrive at what's called the Ruggie principles after Professor John Ruggie, who was the special representative set up to work on this. And the traction came particularly because of multinationals abusing environmental rights and Indigenous rights. So the movement is now on its way. There is an open-ended working group. So states will still have to be the main responsibility, carry the responsibility. But down the road, businesses are going to, if that UN treaty comes up, they're going to have a role to play.
Thank you. I think it also highlights just how important it is to start more discussion and awareness and understanding about what violence online looks like, what violence looks like through the new sort of technological systems. And there is a growing and emerging problem around the use of technology to stalk, to harass, to perpetrate domestic violence. And it's something that's maybe not as well understood as we go forwards. But I think there's some good work being done in that area. Some of us are about to go to the UN Commission on Status of Women next week that is held, and I know that the Australian government is having a side event specifically on this issue of gender-based violence and digital technologies. So we'll hopefully start to see some further advancements in that area in terms of actually seeing how to deal with it.
Can we all go too?
Yeah.
We want to go to that one.
Are there any other questions? There's one at the back. Should we take that one? And
And
then one. So should we take both of those questions and then we'll need to wrap it up. So
Yeah, hi.
Oh, sorry.
Just in relation to the last point, I'm aware that there's a corporate human rights benchmark pilot exercise just about to start. Is the ILO watching what's happening with that?
I don't know. I don't know who is it from the Office of the High Commissioner? Yeah, it's not UN Women, that's for sure.
Oh, well. Oh, you can hear me.
Yeah.
As far as I understand, it's being coordinated in London, but it's cutting across organisations everywhere.
Okay.
It's an international piece of work.
Yeah. Well, for sure, if it comes, when it comes to comment, the organisers would be crazy not to run it through the ILO, because then you've got, again, some really good, a benchmark on which to work from. We had a...
Yeah. Hi, yeah, I had a question about what your advice would be to people who experience sexual harassment at work. And you mentioned before that with cyber harassment, that it's hard to prove and you can't see it. And I'm sure, you know, everyone agrees that sexual harassment is also hard to prove and difficult to demonstrate how this is actually happening. So what advice do you have if, say, you were a supervisor or you were the person in the victim? How would you go about demonstrating that to ensure that it doesn't happen? It's not just, oh, well, that's just the way you interpreted it, or that's not what they meant, or, you know, those types of things.
Well, you've got to go back to training again. And I think the Commission has a very good kit for small enterprises, does it not? The sexual harassment guide.
This is a really big issue that came up sort of a couple of years ago. The Commission does a sexual harassment survey every 5 years or so to really identify what is the prevalence of sexual harassment, because very few people report it and it's very rarely talked about openly. So what we found was that by having a survey, we were able to understand a little bit better about exactly how often it was happening, where it was happening, how it was happening, and also what responses supervisors and managers and employers were giving to sexual harassment. Coming out of that work, we actually produced a whole set of resources for employers as well as for employees who might be experiencing that. It's called Know the Line, right? And it has a whole set of posters, it has resources, it has what kind of policy that workplace should have, how it implements that policy, so that if anybody does experience sexual harassment, what are the normal sort of steps to take to actually address it rather than just shove it under the carpet. So that's quite a useful resource site. Outside at the front, there's some of the employers' resource guides. So as an employer, what should I be doing? There's a very handy resource out on there as well. So Know the Line, it's out there, and it hopefully should be very useful. But I could also say at this point, if you do have any issues around sexual harassment or sex discrimination, please also always contact the Australian Human Rights Commission's information line, where you can talk about if there needs to be a complaint about sexual harassment or sex discrimination under the Sex Discrimination Act.
Right. Yeah. So that was a good way to give it a plug, and I thank you all so much for coming, and fingers crossed for 2018. Maybe you'll all be on the delegation of Australia that year, and maybe you'll be able to influence what really should have been done, I believe, some time ago. But we're on solid ground now, and a very optimistic outlook.
Can I just, before I thank Jane, I just want to flag a sort of a particular product and project that we've been doing. So excuse my giving a big plug here for some of the work that we've been doing, but I'll just show you. 2 years ago, we finally completed a review into the levels of discrimination related to pregnancy, parental leave and return to work after parental leave. One of the big things that came out of that review was that there is a lot of confusion, both amongst employees as well as amongst employers, about how to navigate this period of time during pregnancy, during parental leave, and when you return to work. So following the project, the Commission actually did in conjunction with Office for Women and other government agencies was to create a one-stop shop for employers and employees online, where you can go and get information about each of those stages and where you can get your resources from, just because it's such a confusing area. So we've produced that. Now, what we found in discussions, particularly with employees and employers in small business, was that there wasn't very much access or outreach in those sectors to this kind of information. And one of the things that we found that people in those sectors were really working with was with social media. So what we've actually done is produce a short social media campaign using Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter to actually promote and actually reach out to employers and employees in particularly small business sectors as to how they can access this information, because these are some of the issues that they're coming across every day. Yeah. So I'll just flag that this is now up and running, and we've had some quite cute images that we've tried to produce. So just highlighting the sort of contrasting kind of experiences people can have around this time, and if you're confused about it, where to go for that information. So I just thought I'd share that with you, and look out for it. It's on Facebook, it's on LinkedIn, and it's on Twitter. So it'll be, should be being sent around, and please feel free to send it on as well if you come across them. So we hope you enjoy that. So that's very good. And on that note, can I please thank Jane Hodges for doing such a fantastic job, and for helping us celebrate International Women's Day.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much to all of you for coming out on International Women's Day and actually giving profile and attention to this really serious issue about gender-based violence in the workplace. So thank you very much.